Jay, and welcome everybody to this month's webinar. If you haven't figured it out already from all the pictures and the title in red on the middle of your screen, we're going to be doing a checkbook cover this time. This project was designed for you by Rita Guzzard and presented by myself, Mark Garetz. I'm a national R&K educator. And I always like to show you a picture of what the final project is going to look like before we get into both the software and the construction details. So as we go through those details, you have a good picture in your head of where we're headed, and it just helps things make a little more sense. So we're obviously doing a checkbook cover. You can see on the left, you can see that that's what it looks like when you have your checkbook register and your checks in there. And then you can see in the middle what it looks like when it's opened with nothing in it on the inside. And then the outside has a applique pattern with some decorative motif stitches over the edges of the applique to hold them down, and also some more decorative stippling stitches in the middle of some of the applique pieces. So having said that, let's go ahead and get started with the hold on a second, I have to get rid of this so I can find my mouse. Here we go. So we're going to get started with the software section. Now, there's two parts to the software section for this particular webinar. One is for those of you that own Floriani's Total Quilter package, and the other is for those of you that still just have the My Decorative Quilter 2 package. If you have the My Decorative Quilter 2 package, the instructions for the software part of this project are going to be in the printed instructions that you downloaded along with the rest of the project files, and you'll find a separate MDQ section for the software part. What we're going to be covering today live is the Total Quilter part. So if you haven't done it, you should go ahead and open up Total Quilter already. And again, you'll want to come up to the top here and click this new page icon to get a new design window. And yours may or may not have a grid. I have my grid hidden at the moment, and we are going to be using that grid mode of having it hidden for this particular project. If yours was showing, and I'll just show you real quickly what it looks like. If you have a grid on your screen like that, you can hide it by clicking this icon that I just clicked to show it. You can click it again to hide it, but you can also do it from the grid settings menu and the screen settings menu that we're going to show you here in just a second. Before we get into anything, though, I want to talk about the various types of mouse clicks that we're going to be doing today. We're going to be doing 3 basic different types of clicks, and 4 if you count click and drag. And first of all is a normal left click of the mouse. So that's the click that you normally do most of the time. If I want you to do that, I'm just going to say click. I'm not going to say left click all the time. If I want you to right click, however, I'm specifically going to say right click. So that's a click of the right mouse button. And the other type of click that we're going to do is called a control click. And that is where you hold down the control key on your keyboard and then click the mouse. So the sequence needs to be hold down the control key, click and let off the mouse, and then let up the control key. And it's very important that the control key press and let up are on the opposite sides of your mouse click. Otherwise, it won't work. And then we're going to do click and drag, which is to click with the left mouse and leave it down and drag whatever around and then let it up. And we'll be using that when we manipulate the sequence view today. So first of all, like I said, let's get our screen set up. So what you want to do is come to the top of your ruler bar here, position the mouse over anywhere on this top ruler bar, and do a right click. And when you do that, you're going to get this little dialog box that opens up. You want to make sure that you are in inches mode. You want show grid unchecked. So if it's on, you can uncheck it here. And you snap to grid checked, all right? So just because we're not showing the grid doesn't mean that the grid isn't still active, because it is. We're just hiding it so that we're not distracted by all the grid lines. But we have snap to grid turned on so that as we enter points, they're going to snap to the intersection of the grid lines. So once again, just because the grid is not being shown doesn't mean that the grid isn't active. And then you're going to come finally down here to your grid settings and click it. And the most important setting that we need to worry about for this project is our grid spacing. both horizontal and vertical want to be set to 0.25 or 1/4 of an inch. And your grid major, it doesn't matter because this is just a visual reference. And since we have the grid hidden, it doesn't matter what this is set to. So we're going to lock all those changes in by clicking OK here. And so now we have our grid and our screen set up the same for everybody. The next thing we want to do is select a thread chart. And the way we do that is come down here to our thread chart selector button. So you want to click that, and when you do it, you will get a big list of thread charts to select from. And the one you want to select is this one right here, Floriani Cotton. Now we're going to choose this one, not because we actually want you to stitch the project out in Floriani Cotton. In fact, we want you to use Floriani embroidery thread as well as the new Quilter Select Para Cotton Poly bobbin thread to actually do your stitching. But we're choosing this Floriani Cotton because, as you can see when I click it here, down here is the thread chart we just selected, and it has a very limited color palette. It just has 15 colors. And this makes it easy for us to find and click the color that we want when we work on this project rather than having to scroll through a whole big list of 360 colors to find the colors that we want. So again, we're just using this as an easy way to select our colors. What really matters, of course, is what thread you put on the machine. So the next step we want to do is start out with our basic quilt block so we can start with something to modify it. And for Total Quilter, we're going to use an Applicant block, and they're located right here under this purple icon to select an Applicant block. So you're going to click that, and when you do that, you're going to get a dialog box that opens up that shows you all the Applicant blocks to select from. Now, there's a whole long list of blocks, and they're categorized. So you've got basic blocks, classic blocks, curved blocks, etc. The one you want to be on is pinwheel blocks. And in that group of pinwheel blocks, we want to select the Happy Day block. So you want to click that one. When you do that, it's going to come into the software. And the intent of this is that originally it would have been a quilt block. But we are actually going to modify it to different dimensions, etc., and different purposes so that it becomes an in-the-hoop checkbook project instead. So the first thing we want to do is we want to change the size of this block. Now it comes in as a square block because that's the way most quilt blocks are set up, and it comes in as an 8x8 block by default, but we're going to modify its dimensions by coming over here to our Properties box over here and clicking on the Transform tab. And you can see it came in 8x8. But before we change any of these values, you want to make sure that Maintain Aspect Ratio is unchecked. Now, normally we have this checked because when we make a change to the width, we want the height to change proportionally. For this, we're going to leave it unchecked for this whole project because we're going to modify these independently. And lastly, you want to make sure that you're in inches mode. So what you want to do is make sure those are both set correctly. And then what we're going to do is we're going to decrease our width from 8 to 6.25. So I'm going to put in 6.25. And then I'm going to decrease the height to 6.75. So I'm just going to type over those values. Then I'm going to click Apply to lock those in. Nothing happens over here when you make changes in the Properties box until you click the Apply button. So I've clicked the Apply button, and now you can see it's gotten smaller, but it's also gotten slightly taller than it is wide, which is going to be perfect for our purposes. The next thing we want to do is start decorating this block with some decorative quilting stitches, and we are going to use something called advanced stippling to do that. In order to do that, we're going to actually need to select the pieces of this block that we actually want to apply those stitches to. And what we want to apply them to is the red and the blue pieces of the pinwheel, so basically all the outside pieces. To select an object inside an applicant block, whether it's the fabric area or one of the stitch lines, we can't use our normal select tool. You can see that I've got it selected, and if I'm over the block, all it lets me do is move it around with that hand tool. But I actually want to select these. So we need to use a very special select tool to do that, and it's called the Applicant Object Selection Tool, and it's right here. So if we click that, now we're in a different selection mode, and now I can point to the various pieces that I want to select and click to select them. So we're going to start with this red piece right here, this red applique piece. And I'm going to click to select it. You can see I've got a yellow border around it to tell it that I've got that one selected. And we're going to continue and select all of the blue and the red pieces together so that we can modify them all at once without having to do them independently and separately. So the way we select multiple objects is with a control click. So if I hold down the control key on my keyboard, and then I click on this blue one here, it adds that to the selection that I already have. So I'm going to continue going around clockwise, control clicking on all of the red and the blue pieces. And when I get to this last blue piece here, I'm done. Now I've got all of these objects selected. So now if I apply my advanced stippling stitch to them, I'll get them to go in all at once. The way we apply that advanced stippling stitch is to come down here to our one-click wonders, click this one right here, which is our advanced stippling one-click. And when you click it, you're going to get a window that opens up allowing you to choose the stipple pattern that you want. For this project, we're going to choose stipple 006, which is right here. So I'm going to click that, and you can see when I do that, it brings that pattern in. I'm going to turn on 3D mode so we can see the stitches a little bit bolder. You don't necessarily have to do that at home if you can see them, but just so that you can see them in the video a little easier, I've turned 3D mode on. Now, this pattern is a little bit big for this size of the piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually reduce it. So we're going to do that again over here in our properties box. Here's our pattern size setting. Default for this pattern is 15 millimeters. We want it to be smaller. So I'm going to change it to 10 millimeters. So I'm going to type 10 over the top of that. And while I'm here, I'm actually going to increase the stitch length from the default of 2.5 to 3. And what that's going to do for us is actually make the machine take fewer stitches and just give us a fewer stitches in the final design, because we really don't need the design to be this tight, and it'll save some sewing time. So we're going to go ahead and click apply to lock those in. And you can see now I've got a nice tight pattern in here, and it looks much, much nicer for that size of a shape. The next thing we want to do is we want to modify these applique binding stitches. Now those are the stitches that hold these applique pieces down to our base fabric, and the default is this cross pattern, but we want something a little bit more decorative. So we're going to select all of those stitches, and then we're going to modify them all at the same time. So again, we want to make sure that our applique object selection is selected. And what we're going to do is click right here on the edge of this block, not in it, but we want to be on the edge here near the stitches. And if we click that, you can see it's going to select not just this stitch, but if you look close, you can see it goes all the way around the outside. So that has selected the whole perimeter set of stitches, and now we need to select the inside stitches. So again, I'm going to hold down the control key while I click on the inside stitches. So I'm going to start with this one right here, holding down control and clicking. And you can see I not just selected this little line here, but it's actually a big contiguous line that goes all the way across the block down to here. So I really only need to select 4 sets of stitches. So this one, I'm going to go to this next one here and click it. And I'm going to go to this next one here and click it. And finally this one here and click it. And now I've got all my binding stitches selected. So I can come over here to my properties box once again, select a new binding motif. And the one that we're going to use for this project is Appliquilt, or AQ0, not 00, but AQ29. So I'm going to click the down arrow here, and I'm going to scroll down in this box to find AQ29. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down just a little bit more, so it's a little bit up here. So here it is, and I'm going to click that, and it's going to come in, and the default stitch length for that is 5 millimeters, which turns out to be just fine for this particular purpose, so we're going to leave it alone. Click apply again to apply that new set of stitches, and there it is. So that actually completes everything we need to do in this first step for creating the decorative part of this design. And what we need to do next is we need to start adding the stitches to do placement stitches for our batting, and do the seams and the stitches for our flaps and everything else that we need. So in order to do that, we need to actually save this block. And when we do an Appliquilt style block. We don't actually just save it. Instead, what we do is we export it. There are 3 different export modes in the AppliQuilt module, and they are all right here. And the one we normally use if we're just creating a quilt block would be this export AppliQuilt block. And what that does is it exports each one of these fabric pieces as its own applique piece, and then these all get tacked down to a piece of nylon no-show mesh or something similar, right? But we have another mode called the applique block mode, and what that does is instead of doing each and every one of these pieces, it takes the piece that we choose, like for example this beige background, and actually just makes one big piece out of it instead of making all these little individual pieces, and then gives us just the applique pieces that go on top of it. So there's a contiguous piece of beige fabric behind here. And that's what we're actually going to use for this particular project. The last one that we have is this one right here called faux piecing. And what that does is it takes these decorative patterns and our patterns for these stitches and exports them without any cut pieces, as if you were going to stitch this right down on a single piece of fabric to simulate the look of pieces without actually having done any pieces, and that's why we call it faux piecing. But again, what we're going to do is applique block, which is this last one right here. So we're going to go ahead and click that, and when you do that, this dialog box is going to open up, and you are going to see a bunch of settings. So the first thing we want to do is change our project name from the default of Design 1. And what we're going to do is type in over the top of it, we're going to type in Checkbook Cover. And what that's actually going to do is create a folder named Checkbook Cover in this project folder. So it's going to be C. Floriani Designs AppliQuilt, and then a folder called Checkbook Cover, and then all the rest of the files are going to be called Checkbook Cover something inside this folder. So this kind of serves a dual purpose here. We're going to leave our seam allowance set at 1/4 inch. You definitely want to generate stitch files, but it's important that you change the file format from the default to match your machine. Now I happen to actually have this machine, which is the first one in the list, so I would leave this alone. But if you have a different machine, you'd want to click the drop down over here and select from any of these other machine formats. But again, I'm going to just leave the one there. You want to also click as digitized because we want that to happen just like we created it instead of the way it thinks it ought to. If you have a digital cutter, you want to check cut files. If you don't have one, you can uncheck this. What this does, it's going to output all of the files we need to cut our applique pieces with a digital cutter. And we can choose the file format. The default is SVG, and this works with every cutter that's out there pretty much. But if you also happen to own a scan and cut, you can click the drop down and you can choose the FCM format, which is the native file format for the scan and cut. So that might be a little bit more convenient for you if you own a scan and cut. For other cutters, you want to leave it on SVG. You can leave your page size alone at 12 by 12. None of the pieces are that big. And this is important. You want to make sure that the software chose the correct background fabric for you. So the way you choose the background fabric, if it didn't, is you click on this colored square, and it's going to show you all the possibilities. So if for some reason you wanted the red to be the background fabric, you could switch it up. But we want it to be the beige for this project, so it correctly selected it. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that's the one and click OK. And then lastly, down here in your print options, if you don't own a digital cutter and you want to cut your applique pieces by hand, you will want to check this for manual cutting box, and then you will want to click the preview icon. And that's going to bring up your print preview for this project. So let's go through the things that are in the print preview. And you might want to print this anyway, even if you have a digital cutter, so you can just have a roadmap of what's happening. But this is just a picture of what the design looks like. If you go next, you will see here is our sewing sequence. If you go next, you'll see here's the cut files for the Columbia blue. Next one is the cut files for the rust or red color. The next one is the first green color, the spring green. The next one is our big beige background piece, and the next one is going to be our last green. And so that's what's in here, and you would print these out either on a piece of paper and then trace your applique onto the back of your applique stitch material, or print them out directly onto the back side of either applique wonder or applique stick material, on the back of them. If you do that, you're going to want to print these in reverse. So if you're going to print on the back of your applique material, you want to print those in reverse, and you'll want to do that mirror printing or reverse printing in your print settings dialog for your printer. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'm actually going to uncheck for manual cutting because I happen to have a digital cutter. So I'm going to go ahead now and click export so you can see what happens. It's going to export all the files we need into this folder, and again it's at C Floriani Designs Appliquilt, and here's our new folder, Checkbook Cover. And you can see I've got all the files that I need, and I'm actually going to now close this. And the next thing we want to do is we want to actually open up the stitch file that got generated. Now, if all you have is Total Quilter, you can double click right here and it'll reopen up in Total Quilter. But since I also have FTCU, our embroidery program, I've got that set to open up PES files, and I don't want to open it up in that. So if I double click this, it would automatically open there. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to open it directly from Total Quilter instead. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window, and then I'm going to come up here to my Open, click that, and I'm going to navigate to the same place. And just to show you one more time where that is, I'll click this drop down. You can see it's at C Floriani Designs Appliquilt Checkbook Cover. All right, so here's the two files that we could possibly open. I saved the WAF file as well as the stitches file, and this is the one that you want to open. And the file extension will change based on what machine format you chose. Now, I'm not actually going to open it right now because when you open this file, a warning is that this looks like a very simple set of stitches, but actually it's pretty complex. And so what happens is it actually takes the software sometimes up to a couple of minutes to open it up. And that depends on what you have running, how fast your computer is, and some other factors. And I happen to have a lot of stuff running. I got my PowerPoint going in the background. We've got the webinar software running. So it's actually going to take several minutes to open this up. So I've gone ahead and pre-opened it so we don't have to wait for 2 or 3 minutes live here while this opens. So I'm actually going to cancel this, and you can see here I've got it open on a different tab. So I'm going to click that to show you what it looks like. And again, I'm going to turn on 3D so you can see the stitches a little bit better. Now, one thing I want to say before we start working with the set of stitches is that when you click that open and it starts to try to open, you're going to see a blank screen, and you're going to see the little circle just kind of turning and turning and turning and turning while the software is working. Don't think that the software has crashed, or don't think that nothing's going to happen. You just want to be patient and give it some time to open. Eventually it will open. You know, maybe go get a cup of coffee or some water, or take a little break or something. Come back in 3, 4, 5 minutes and it'll be open for you on your screen. What you don't want to do is try and somehow get it to open faster by clicking around, or see if you can close it or whatever. Don't click anything when you see that little turning icon, because that's a surefire way to confuse the software and cause it to crash. So just relax and let it open on its own. All right, so now we are going to start modifying this design to add some extra stitches in to create our In the Hoop project. So the first thing we want to do is come over here to our sequence view and select the last item. And what we want to do is we want to change its width and height. So with it selected, we're going to come up to our Properties box, click our Transform tab one more time, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to add a 1/4 inch here. So we're going to change this to 6.5, and we're going to change this to 7. Now before I lock that in by clicking Apply, this is the set of stitches out here that we're working with. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to expand it out to be a little bit bigger. So we're going to go ahead and click apply, and it's going to create a set of stitches that's 1/8 of an inch off where it was, because it's 1/4 inch on each side. So it's kind of in between where our existing stitches were. We're going to need a copy of this. So with it selected, we're going to come up to our copy icon and click that. And then we're going to click our paste icon to get a copy. And now you can see I've got 2 identical sets of run stitches in here. We are going to click on, we need to actually click on it to select all of them. And we are going to move this up to the front, because that is going to become, this set of stitches is going to become the placement line for our batting, and it's going to become the placement or the tack down line for the batting. So we need these to stitch out first. So the way to get them to stitch out first, so we need to move them to the top of the sequence view so they stitch out first. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to click on this last item and drag it up to the top and let off the mouse. Hold on a second, I need a drink of water. Okay, now I can keep talking. So now these are both going to stitch out first. Now, we want the machine to stop between this run and this run. So in order to do that, we're actually going to change the thread color of this second run. So I'm going to select just the second run over here in the sequence view. And it doesn't really matter what color we change it to, because we're not going to actually change the thread. We just want the machine to stop. So, but we're going to use the sky blue color. So I'm going to come over here to my thread palette and click sky blue. And that's going to put it into a new thread color, so the machine will stop between this run and this run. Now, like I said, this second set of stitches here, this is actually going to become our tack down for the batting. So just a straight run isn't going to actually cut it for that. We're going to actually change this into a motif stitch. So we're going to come up to our type here in our properties, click the down arrow, and select motif. And we're going to change from a line motif to motif 205. And that's going to be a cross pattern, which is going to step out on the inside and tack down our batting real nice. Now we need a little bit bigger step from the default to 4 millimeters, so we're going to change that to a 7. And we don't really need it to be this tight of a pattern, so we're going to expand the space between the patterns by adjusting our run spacing, and we're actually going to change that to 7 as well, and click apply. And when that set of stitches go in, you'll now see that I've got sort of a railroad track effect here with nice stitches that are spaced quite far apart, which is all we need for our tack down. Now what we need to do is we need to, in the sequence view, click on the third item. So I'm going to come here and click on this third item, and we're actually going to change its height and width as well. So we're going to come back up to the Transform tab in our Properties box, and we're going to change this to 7, our width to 7, and our height to 7.5. Again, we are going to check that, and it is going to increase it by another 1/4 of an inch, so 1/8 of an inch all the way around. We need to make a copy of this, so we're going to click copy, and we're going to click paste, and our copy is now going to end up down here at the bottom. And we need to change its thread color, so we're going to change it to sky blue. So we are going to again click sky blue, and now what we need to do is we need to move it, because we need it to stitch after this set of stitches right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to click, and we're going to drag it, and we're going to drop it right on top of them. And the way this works again is when you drag on top of something and you let off the mouse, it actually ends up right below it. So now we've got one set, we've got the second set in a different color, so it'll stitch this one and then stitch this one, and that's going to become the placement and the tack down for our fabric. All right, and what we need to do now is add some stitch lines for our sewing. So what we're going to do is come up to the very first item in our sequence view. Again, we are going to utilize this twice, so we're going to do a copy and a paste. and that's going to end up down at the bottom again, which is actually where we want it. And this is going to end up being the stitch that stitches the backing fabric to the rest of the project. And so what we want to do is come up to our properties box and change it from a single run into a double run, because this is going to be the seam. We're going to turn this inside out, so we want it to be a nice heavy stitch, so we're going to change to a double run. We want a little bit tighter stitch, so we're going to change to a stitch length of 2.5 and apply that. And we actually, for the last thing we need to do is we need to actually make this a lot taller, because this is going to stitch out the big piece of background fabric, and you'll see this when we get to the actual construction details. So we're going to again come to our transform tab, and all we want to do this time is change the height to 11 inches and click apply. And that's going to make it so big it's going to go off my screen. So if I double click my magnifying glass to zoom out, you can see this second set of stitches is real nice and big out here. So this represents the edge of our actual project when it gets in the hoop. So I'm going to zoom back in, and I'm going to do that just by simply doing a zoom in here, because the last thing we need to do is we need to create a hole in this set of stitches about right here, because we need to be able to turn this inside out. So if we just stitched it all the way around, we wouldn't be able to turn this inside out when we're done. So what we need to do is actually take this big rectangle of stitches and split it into multiple parts so we can get rid of a piece of it. And the way we do that is, with it selected, we come over to our shape tool and click it, and then we can point with the shape tool anywhere on this stitch line, and we can split this into two parts. And so where you want to be is kind of right above this point right here. Just anywhere right in here, it really doesn't matter that much. So just somewhere in this area, point to the line with your cursor, right click on your mouse, and select split line. And what that's done is actually split this into two parts. But since the part ends and stops in the same place, it actually is still one piece. It just has a split right in here. And really what we need to do is split it into two parts. So what we need to do is split it again, this time in this area down here, kind of the opposite of where we were. So I'm going to right click in here, select split line again, and you can see what happens is that now, if you look over in our sequence view, you'll see we have this little run sequence right here, and then we have the big one that goes all the way around. We don't need this one, so we're actually going to delete it. So I'm going to come over to my sequence view and click on it to select it. So you can see that's the little piece in here that I created when I split it away from the outside. And I'm going to actually delete that piece. So I'm going to come up here to my cut icon and click it, and that's going to delete it. And now all I'm left with is this kind of C-shaped run here that goes all the way around but has a gap over here. So that actually completes all of the things we need to do in the software. The final step we need to do, of course, is save this. And the way we're going to do that is come to our File, Save As menu. And the first thing you want to do is save this as a WAF file. Now, this checkbook cover WAF here, that's our original block, so we're not going to overwrite that. What we're going to do is we're going to type in FTQ checkbook cover to say this is the one we are final with, and we're going to say save, and so that's going to by default save it as the WAF file, and then we need to save it one more time in our machine format. So I am going to once again click File, Save As, and this time from the drop down below here I would select my machine format. Now it's kind of remembered that I've already given it the FTQ checkbook cover name. So if I just select a different file format, so in this case for my machine I would select this one, the Baby Lock Brother Multi-Needle, and it's going to keep that name. I'm just going to click Save, and now I have my final stitch file that I can use in the construction details. And so we're going to move on to that now. We're done with the software. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. So I'm going to reopen my PowerPoint. Again, this is a picture of what it looks like. You've got your inside with the checkbook and the check register. We've got our inside opened up. You can see the flaps here, and then our outside with our motif applique patterns. So I'm going to go ahead and move on now to our materials that you're going to require for this. You're going to need some Floriani nylon no-show mesh stabilizer. You're going to need some Floriani Applique Wonder or Quilter Select Applistick. That's your applique material for putting the sticky back on your fabric. You are going to need some Floriani embroidery batting. You're going to need some medium weight fusible interfacing. You're going to want to have some Floriani embroidery thread as well as some Quilter Select Paracotton poly bobbin thread. And you want to choose colors that work well with your fabric choices. And you are going to see the bobbin thread on part of this project, so you do want to choose a bobbin thread color that works well with your fabric. Obviously, you'll want to choose top thread color that works well with your fabric as well. And you're going to need a 7-inch by 11-inch or 180 millimeter by 200 millimeter or larger hoop size. And lastly, you're going to want to have an R&K precision turning tool to make it much easier to turn this project inside out. Now we're going to prepare our fabric. So you're going to have to cut one piece that's 7.5 by 8-inch for the inside background. You're going to need two 2.5 by 7.5-inch pieces for the inner flaps. You're going to need one 7.5 by 11.5-inch piece for the outside backing fabric. You're going to need one 6.5 by 7-inch piece of Floriani embroidery batting. And it's important that you cut this piece precisely. You're going to need 4 fat 8s for the applique shapes. And lastly, two 2 by 7-inch strips of the medium weight fusible interfacing. So now we're going to prep the fabric. We're going to pre-cut the shapes. And you have 3 different ways you could do that. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but let me mention it again. You can fuse the applique material to the fabric and then cut them directly with the cut files that you generated with your digital cutter. And that's absolutely the best and easiest and fastest way to do it. So you might want to get a digital cutter if you don't have one. The other way you could do it is you could print the shapes in reverse on the paper side of the applique material, then fuse them to the fabric, and then cut the shapes by hand. Or you could print the shapes in reverse on normal paper and then trace the shapes onto the paper side of Applistick. Now, it's important that you use Applistick for this if you're going to do the tracing, because the major difference between Applistick and Applique Wonder is that Applistick is more translucent, which makes it easier to trace through. And then again, you're going to fuse them to the fabric and then cut the pieces out by hand. And lastly, you want to fuse that interfacing to the wrong side of the flaps. So before we embroider, it's important to note that some of the color changes in this design are there simply to make the machine stop between the steps. You can leave the same thread in, or you can change it as desired. And most of the time you'll want to leave it in because it's just there to make the machine stop. But if you have a multi-needle machine, you will be, excuse me, start that again. If you have a multi-needle machine, you're going to want to use the machine controls in that machine to insert the stop commands to make the machine stop between the colors. If you don't do that, it's just going to zoom right onto the next color without stopping, and you won't be able to put your applique pieces down or your fabric down or your batting down, and we need it to stop so you can do that. So it's very important to do that step. All right, so let's go ahead and embroider the design now. You're going to load the FTQ or MDQ checkbook cover design into your machine, depending on which software you use to create it. You'll want to hoop up a piece of Floriani nylon no-show mesh stabilizer. You want to get it hooped nice and tight. Attach the hoop to the machine and stitch out the first color, which will be the placement line for your batting. Next, you'll want to center that batting within the placement lines nice and accurately, and then stitch the next color to stitch the batting to the stabilizer. You can see how that cross-stitch pattern there stitches into the stabilizer to hold it down a little bit. And then what you want to do is stitch the next color, which will become the placement line for the background fabric. Then what you want to do is center your background fabric right side up within the placement line. So there's 2 background fabrics. One is the small one, one's the big one. This is obviously going to be the smaller of the 2. And then stitch the next color to tack that fabric down. Next, you'll want to stitch the next color, which will be the placement lines for all of the shapes. So we call this the skeleton, and it's going to stitch all the placement lines for all of the shapes all at once. So unlike a traditional applique, you're going to get all the placement lines at once. And then what you want to do is peel the paper from the back of the shapes and place those shapes down, sticking them down within the placement lines. Again, unlike a traditional applique where you would do one at a time, in this project and for Applicant Designs, you're going to stick all of the pieces down at the same time. And just a little hint, it helps to keep things lined up if you start with the pieces that touch the center. So start in the center and work your way to the outside. Next, what you want to do is maybe now you want to change the thread color, because now you're going to stitch the motif stitches, and you'll want to choose a color that works well with the fabric that you've chosen, and you'll stitch that next color to stitch them out. Next, you might want to change the color one more time for the cover stitches and go ahead and stitch those out, and those are the stitches that are going to stitch over the edges of our applique fabric and hold them in place. Lastly, you will want to line up, not lastly, we have a few more steps, sorry about that. Next, you'll want to line up the flat fabric right sides down along the outer stitch line. So as you can see in the picture here, your fabric is going to be going towards the center, and the outside edges are going to be lined up with the stitch lines, and the edges of the fabric will be lined up with your background fabric. And you'll stitch the next two colors, which will sew the flaps down. And then what you want to do is fold the flaps back outwards along those stitch lines and press them into place. Next, what you want to do is center the backing fabric right side down over the stitch lines and the fabric underneath, and then stitch the next color to sew the backing fabric down. You can see this is that stitch that has the opening in the side. Then you can remove the project from the machine and also remove the project from the hoop. The next step is to trim it a scant 1/4 inch all the way around the design, except at where that opening is. You want to leave about a 1/2 inch there, as you can see. Then you want to trim off the corners at an angle, like you can see in the picture here, to make the corner sharper when we turn it out. Just real important, don't get so super close to the corner that you cut the thread, because that will be not good. What you want to do is get just a little bit away from the thread. Next, what you want to do is turn it inside out and then push the corners out with your R&K precision turning tool, and then tuck the excess fabric that's at the gap inside. So it's going to tuck inside, and when you're done, and once you press it, it will look like the outside and inside pictures here that you can see. So press it nice and flat so your seams are nice. And then what you want to do is fold the top and bottom flaps in towards the center at their seam lines. And at this point you can pin them if you want, but if you pin them in the center and not at the outside, because the next thing we're going to do is sew very close to the edge of both sides to close up the gap and secure the folds in place. And so once you've done that, we are done. All you need to do is fold your checkbook in half, and it's completed. And all you need to do then is put your check register in and put your checks in, and you are good to go. We want to thank you for attending this webinar. This completes it. We hope you will use this video along with the printed PDF instructions to recreate the project at home, and we invite you to come back next month for our next project. And I've gotten a preview of it, and we've been working on it. It's a pretty cool project. I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag yet, but it's a pretty cool little project. You're going to want to come back next month for that one. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to DJ Anderson.
Thank you, Mark, for another great webinar, and we're excited to see what you guys do with this project, and so please do make sure that you post onto the Facebook page what you create so that we can take a look at it. And again, thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we will see you next time.
See you next time.